Hey everyone, I'm Cam, and it's November 6th, which is a few days after America's presidential election. So what I wanted to talk about today is voter fraud and claims of voter fraud. There are a lot of claims of voter fraud coming from President Trump, which, although not unexpected, is very dangerous and problematic. And that's because voter fraud and false claims of voter fraud are very dangerous to our free society. They foster distrust as to the basic mechanism that allows democracy to work. And that's because democracy is fundamentally the idea that the people govern themselves. And the mechanism that we use for the people to govern themselves is an election. It's the way that the people make their voice heard in a democracy, and without that we don't have a way for the people to make their voice heard. It's in Latin they call it the sine qua non, without which democracy couldn't exist. So if there is voter fraud, what that means is that there's essentially an attack to the very mechanism that allows democracy to continue, and that would be very dangerous if it happened. And it's dangerous because it distorts the will of the people. It distorts the voice of the people, which means that democracy isn't functioning properly. That being said, voter fraud should be relatively easy to spot, especially if it's at the level to affect an election that in a country of 330 million people. And there's basically two ways. I mean, you look to see who voted, who's not legally allowed to, and the second way, whose votes are not counted that should have been. And the punishment for people who engage in voter fraud should be swift and immediate because of how dangerous it is to the continuation of our free society. But the truth is, there's not that much voter fraud in the United States. It's certainly not enough to sway the presidential election. One of the ways you can check is just look for prosecutions for voter fraud, and you'll find precious few. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can take the president's word for it, or at least his committee. Because if you remember, the president in 2016 claimed that there were 3 million or 5, I think it was 3 to 5 million illegally cast votes for Hillary Clinton. And he set up a committee in order to investigate that. So that committee was called the Presidential Advisory Committee on Election Integrity. He set it up in May of 2017 and it disbanded in January of 2018. So the report from that committee found that there was no evidence of voter fraud, meaning that the 3 to 5 million illegal votes that were cast, according to President Trump, was wrong, that was incorrect, it was false, it was fake, it was a lie. And unfortunately, the president is making similar claims now in this election. And so based on his record of lying about voter fraud in the past, hopefully you won't believe him in the present. But anyhow, let's talk about false claims of voter fraud, because that's what's going on now. False claims of voter fraud. And I believe that false claims of voter fraud are more dangerous than actual voter fraud. And I believe that because real voter fraud in America doesn't really exist. It doesn't really exist. But false claims of voter fraud do. In fact, false claims of voter fraud are exponentially more prevalent in America than actual voter fraud. And that's really important because false claims of voter fraud erode the people's trust in the accuracy of the elections for no good reason. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the people are less likely to trust the one mechanism that allows the people to govern themselves in a democracy, an election. And what does that mean in turn? Well, it means that people who believe the false claims of voter fraud, will be more likely to engage in violence because they perceive that the election is being stolen, that it's unfair, that democracy is being perverted. So who would make false claims of voter fraud? Well, let's figure this out from first principles, right? It's a person who's more interested in keeping their own power than they are about sustaining and strengthening the institutions that we as a people, as a free society, need to govern ourselves in the long term. So it's one person's desire for short-term gain that they use against our society's long-term need to keep the mechanism that allows us to govern ourselves in place. And that's selfish, it's cynical, and it's dangerous. In a word, it's Donald Trump. It's why that man's unfit for office, because he's willing to put our long-term free society at risk for his own gain for 4 years. That's why I said that you should not vote for Donald Trump. It's why I believe that we need him to be voted out. We need him gone. It's because Donald Trump is more worried about his own interests than he is in the common good. And worse than that, he's willing to destroy the common good for his own selfish gain. He needs to go. All right, so look. So when people claim voter fraud, it's incumbent upon us, it's necessary for us to demand evidence, good evidence of voter fraud. Somebody saying something is not enough. And if the claims are real, we need to attack it hard and head on. But if the claims are false, we need to punish those people who are making those false claims, because it's super destructive to America. Because false claims of voter fraud actually incentivize people to do the very thing that those claims claim to rail against, which is silence the will of the people. And that's extremely dangerous. In fact, it's antithetical to democracy. It's anti-democratic. It's authoritarian. I want to end with 2 important points. First, if there is voter fraud, it needs to be attacked hard and immediately. You can't let that kind of thing stand because it's destructive to democracy. But again, there is no evidence that there is any voter fraud in America. And it's incumbent upon the people who make those claims of voter fraud to bring that evidence forward. And it's incumbent upon us to demand that evidence because of how dangerous those claims can be to the stability of our free society. And the second point is that false claims of voter fraud, which are exponentially more prevalent than actual voter fraud, they need to be immediately identified and punished. Because we need to discourage hard anybody who's willing to sacrifice the stability of our system long term for short-term gain. We cannot allow that to be a norm. It has to be publicly shamed. It has to be politically impossible. So that's my take on voting fraud and false claims of voting fraud. And listen, if you got this far in watching, first of all, thank you. What I'm trying to do here is think out loud in front of people, because I see the conversations that we're having in America, and I see them as fundamentally destructive instead of constructive. And conversations where we think rationally about things that are important to all of us are necessary for our country to function. Because without, as Sam Harris says, a series of successful conversations, we're left with violence and force, and that's untenable in this free society of ours. So if you like this, please share it with people on social media, your friends, your family. And I encourage you to get out there and talk to people who think differently than you and listen to them. And I'm going to do my best to continue modeling the way that I believe we should think about things. And if I'm wrong, then I'd like you to point it out to me respectfully. And I think it's important that we evolve in our thinking and the way we act towards each other. So with that, stay calm and listen to each other, because it's important that we figure out where the other person is coming from so that we can come to some sort of compromise, because that's what a democracy is built on. Thanks for listening.